welcome back to my channel. Thank you all for your comments from the last videos, which I will try and get through as soon as I can, but bear with me on that one. So in this video, I wanted to come back to Darko Sarovic's study or theoretical framework on autism and the mechanisms that contribute towards a clinical diagnosis of autism. Because I've talked about this before, I've done some videos on this before, but I just wanted to come back to it because the other day I watched Darko Sarovic's presentation on this model, whereas previously I'd only read the article, but it was quite interesting just to hear him talking about it, and it kind of, I don't know, just sort of like consolidated it a bit more in my mind, and I just thought I'd like to come back to it. Sometimes it's can be helpful to sort of like come back to things previously discussed. So Darko Sarovic, he's a I think he's like a clinician, but he's also a researcher, but I'm not entirely sure, I'd have to find out. He's a doctor anyway, but also a scientist, like he studies autism. And his theoretical model is entitled actually I'm not sure what the full title is, but it's basically the pathogenetic triad. That's what his theoretical framework is looking at. It's called the pathogenetic triad. I'll get on to the meat of it in a minute. So, what Darko says or claims is that there is a shared continuum between autistic-like traits and diagnosis. That it is the number and intensity of traits that predicts the probability of diagnosis. He also says that some individuals can use intelligence and executive functioning skills to overcome some of the issues of having a pronounced autistic personality traits. In other words, cognitive compensation, and therefore avoid needing to be diagnosed, essentially, so they remain sub-threshold. But pronounced autistic traits mean a greater likelihood of having difficulties with areas such as social communication. However, through conscious and unconscious cognitive mechanisms, the person can learn social protocol and improve their perceived social ability. So they still might have some difficulties, but if they're able through superior executive functioning and superior intelligence to compensate significantly enough, then they might not need an actual diagnosis and they remain sub-threshold with pronounced autistic-like traits, but without actually needing a diagnosis. So the higher the executive functions and the higher the global intelligence is, the more they inhibit association between the traits and a diagnosis. So Darko then looks at the risk factors which can reduce the person's ability to cognitively compensate for the autistic-like traits. And when the person is exposed to risk factors that reduce that ability to cognitively compensate, it becomes increasingly likely that they will reach clinical threshold and get a diagnosis. But these risk factors that increase the risk for autism are also found to increase the risk for other disorders too. So there is a low specificity for any one diagnosis, because exposure to risk inhibits brain development, and this inhibition of brain development increases the risk for all disorders, not just autism. ADHD, schizophrenia, OCD, learning disabilities, the whole array, basically. And obviously, the condition that the person ends up getting is not due to the risk factors themselves, it's due to the interaction between the risk factors and the genes that that person carries. So the actual risk factors themselves are not specific. They increase the risk for all of those disorders, but what disorder a person gets is down to the genes that they carry, essentially. And obviously it depends on the interaction between the genes and the risk factors, how many risk factors a person is exposed to, and the intensity of the risk factors, and all of these. So this proposes a single mechanism, what Darko calls a neuropathological burden, or neuropathological burden. The higher the neuropathological burden, the lower the cognitive attainment. And so the greater the likelihood of a diagnosis being reached. And few, if any, of the risk factors are specific for autism. It's found to increase risk for other disorders too, because cognitive ability is impaired as these risk factors affect the brain. And with reduced cognitive ability means a reduced ability to compensate for any traits the person has. So it's kind of basically, you develop a disorder, in other words, if and only if you have pronounced traits for any one condition. So it might be pronounced autistic traits, someone else might have pronounced ADHD traits, there might be pronounced schizotypal traits. So depending upon what genetic traits the person carries, which in and of themselves, this model argues, the traits in and of themselves are not necessarily pathological. So a person could have a high number of ADHD traits or a high number of autistic traits and a high number of schizotypal traits and be functioning really well and not need a diagnosis. But if they're exposed to risk factors, it's the interaction between those risk factors and the traits a person carries that can then sort of tip them over the edge towards actually getting a diagnosis. So this is a single mechanism behind all of the disorders: inhibition of brain and cognitive development. And Darko says that this would explain why the average cognitive ability across clinical samples for all disorders is lower than for the average population, which suggests that because there is this overall lower cognitive ability, which across clinical samples, that would imply that there is this interaction between low cognitive ability or lower cognitive abilities in clinical populations, and why the person would experience greater difficulty and greater impairment because they're not able to compensate for the traits so well. So there's going to be more severe executive functioning problems, more severe working memory deficits, more severe processing deficits, some of them might have learning disabilities, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, so I'm just going to move over to video number 2 now to carry on discussing this really interesting model, which I think has a lot of sense, but also does contain quite a number of questions. But it is only a theoretical framework, so it does need to be more empirically validated and tested. But to me, it does make quite a lot of sense as a tentative explanation. So moving over to video number 2 now, just to carry on talking about this model.